Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming to this panel, The State of Independence. It's awesome to see a full room. My name is Nick O'Byrne. I'm the General Manager of AIR, which is the Australian Independent Record Labels Association. AIR has about 200 members in Australia, and maybe about 60 or 70 of them are what I'd call, functioning independent labels that are releasing, quite a lot of music, more than just a hobby in Australia. It's a very diverse membership. We have niche labels releasing, all sorts of ambient, abstract music right through to some of Australia's biggest music companies, and that is a reflection on the gamut of the independent sector in Australia, but also around the world. That's a bit of a background about that, but this isn't really about me. It's about these guys on the panel and their labels and all of their opinions. So I'm going to introduce to you, on my right, Ben Howe from New Zealand of the record label Arch Hill Recordings.
Hello.
Yeah. Shin Fukuzumi from Peavine. The apparently sexy Toby L.
Yes. Guilty.
Yeah. From Transgressive. And then we have James Davis from Arc Recordings. Also sexy, don't we? And Stuart Coupe over there. And I don't want to leave you out, so you're sexy too.
Thank you very much, Nick. Appreciate it. Keep talking.
Now, what I thought I'd do is just do a bit of an introduction to, or let these guys introduce their own labels and the artists that they work with, and maybe tell a bit about, what you do, so we know where you're coming from. And we'll just go right along the panel, and you guys. Well, before we do, maybe wait till these intros are finished. But feel free to ask questions throughout. We've got a kind of vague plan, but we'd like to take this conversation, wherever you guys want to take it. If you're interested, ask a question. Stand up and yell it out. Cool. Ben.
So Arch Hill Recordings is a New Zealand record label. We've been around for around 12 years. We're based up in Auckland. Got a catalogue of about 50 or 60 sort of albums. The label started actually out of a band. I was in a band on probably New Zealand's best known record label called Flying Nun Records. And the band broke up, and the main guy from there, I decided to release his solo album largely as an experiment, and it kind of worked out quite well. And we had a recording studio as well, and really the label was kind of born out of, first of all, a band, and secondly, a recording studio. And since then, I guess, I would say for the first 5 years it was very much kind of a hobby. I was also writing a thesis at university, which helped pay for my time working on the record label, and I never quite finished that thesis.
What was it a thesis on?
I was actually on New Zealand independent record labels, funnily enough. So about 5 years in, I suppose I started releasing things that either weren't my own band or friends' bands, and started signing other acts. And sort of since then, I suppose I've worked a balance of releases from new artists. I mean, some of the more recent ones are ones like Surf City, Street Chant, Transistors, who are playing this evening at 9:40 p.m.
Venue?
What venue?
Rick's Bar, very good band. I recommend them. And then some, I suppose, what you would call quite sort of legendary or iconic New Zealand acts. I released albums by The Clean, who were one of the first bands on Flying Nun, and are still going strong now, as well as The Bats, Spouter Space, David Kilgour, an artist, Don McGlashan, who was kind of, I suppose, New Zealand's, maybe not Paul Kelly, but kind of in that kind of region. That's the history of the label. It isn't, it certainly hasn't made me wealthy, and I do many other things in the music industry to help support that, but to be perfectly honest, running a record label is actually the thing I enjoy doing the most, and I really love doing it. So if I can do other things in music to help support and sustain that, then I will do that.
Awesome. Shin?
I used to work for, well, I still currently do a little bit, for CoSide Records, which is a label, probably one of the largest and longest running Japanese independent labels that's been going for like 7 years now. Initially started off as like a soul blues label. It's genre-wise, it's all over the map now. I've been A&Ring there for the last 5-6 years. The label's worked on like thousands of, different artists, but probably in the indie field, people like Sufjan Stevens, Anthony and the Johnsons, sort of the big labels like Sub Pop and Drag City, Matador. We've had a history of working with those guys. On my A&R roster, I've worked with people like My Morning Jacket and John Butler Trio, recently Chet Faker, CK, Jeff Lang, kind of all over the place. But I've just recently started my own imprint, which goes through P-Vine, and I'll be carrying those artists through that, and kind of exciting times for me right now. But that's what I've been basically doing, and I grew up over here, so I've got a natural connection with Australian artists and kind of concentrated on trying to release those types of bands in Japan because it was just so unknown for the last, decade. So yeah, that's pretty much what I do.
Yeah, I co-started Transgressive Records about just under 8 years ago, so it's quite a new company in the grand scheme of things. Started it with my best friend and drinking partner, Tim Dello. He basically was someone that sort of accosted me in a club when we were mutually introduced to each other by Kelly Okariki, the singer from Block Party. Kelly was basically a friend of Tim's and also a friend of mine because I used to put on Block Party shows back in London when they were an unsigned band, and Tim put out their debut single, which we actually reissued this year for Record Store Day on, as part of their sort of like comeback, which was really nice, sort of full circle. And over the last 8 years, we sort of diversified. We went from just doing 7 inches and all that sort of stuff and doing podcasts in the early days, right the way through to now doing sort of like albums, also do publishing and management. Our roster includes Two Door Cinema Club on the publishing side, who I think just got number 4 in Australia, which is pretty amazing. And bands like Foals and the Antlers, Neon Indian. And we've also worked in the past with bands like the Shins and Graham Coxon, who Jamie also worked with. So yeah, so really eclectic and yeah, lots of cool stuff going on all the time.
Cool. Jamie.
I used to run a label called Transcopic with Blur guitarist Graham Coxon for the Toby knows for about 7 years, and that was weird and wonderful. And then I started my new label called Arc, which I've been doing for about 7 years. My partner is a booking agent. He books bands that you would have heard of, like the White Stripes and the Strokes and the Foo Fighters and stuff. And we've got a small little independent based in London. Got about 3 acts, and just fighting for the cause.
I had an independent label in the early 1980s called Green Records, because Kermit the Frog said it ain't easy being green, and we found that out pretty quickly. We released about 50 records, and I thought, okay, I've done my time with an independent record label. Then in 1999, I got lured back into the world of independent releases, and that was the start of Laughing Outlaw Records, which is now 13 years old. We've released about 170, I still call them records, in that time. It's diverse. Laughing Outlaw is a classic fans label. It's run by Vicky, my wife, and I, and we kind of just release things that we like. It's if something gets to the point where I'm obsessing about it and I'm playing it at the house for 2 or 3 months non-stop, and I'm going, I love this, then we bring it out. So there's no real rhyme nor reason. We've done reissues, we've done punk rock records, we've done jazz records. I'm about to license a reggae album of Nirvana cover versions from my buddy here, because I've always wanted to do some reggae releases. Yeah,
Yeah, great. No, that works for me.
Yeah, that's what I thought.
Deal's been done.
Deal's been done right in front of you. So yeah, it's just whatever we're passionate about. We manage some of the artists on the label, and yeah, we're distributed by inertia. We license some things from overseas, but for the most part, it's a very Sydney-centric label. We have a few artists from Melbourne, and it dawned on me a while ago that 80% of the label is from Sydney, with the exception of Charlie Horse, who are sitting over there. Pretty much everyone on the label lives within 2 kilometres of the office. So in a world of global expansion, we're shrinking.
Cool. you know, when we were asked, you know, before you do these panels, you get sent an email and it's like, talk about this and we want you to explore this. And one of them was the great history of independent record labels, which is, you know, you could do a whole conference on that, so we're not really going to go that deep into it, but it'd be really cool for you guys to talk about... oh, actually, sorry, before we do, I believe you've prepared something.
Me? Jamie's
Yeah, is that right?
No, all I did was write a list of, because I've got a terrible memory, so I just wrote a list of, when you asked me, my historic labels, I know what they are.
Okay, yeah. Okay, great. Well, I'll ask you first, but I want to talk about inspiration and, you know, motivation, the things that inspired you, you know, when you were growing up as a kid, and the labels that you knew, or maybe didn't even know of at the time, but certainly knew that the artists. And yeah, so why don't you read from your list?
Well, I think it was probably Nirvana that started it all for me. Just being a fan of theirs, and they were very pro talking about, you know, new bands and new labels and whatever. And if you were into Nirvana, you just kind of dived straight into that, and you got into Sub Pop and Discord and all those great labels, and you saw just people that were playing in bands, releasing their own records, and you know, they were small American labels, but they came over to the UK, and we were all like really big fans of theirs. So, you know, that's kind of how I got started into independent labels, basically.
Yeah, cool. I think Nirvana was, like, a lot of people mentioned Sub Pop in that little email exchange that we had. And, you know, anyone else want to add, you know, talk about your inspiration, Ben?
Well, I guess my inspiration is very localised to New Zealand and may not mean so much to people here, but I mean, there is actually a lot of great little labels that have come out of New Zealand over the years. Ones like Propeller and Ripper, who, you know, did kind of early punk rock compilations and bands that basically when I was at high school I could go along and see. But I mean, referring back to Flying Nun, I suppose, as you know, being a band on that, it was sort of like a label that, you know, I aspired to be on, and when I finally, you know, as a 20-year-old, we got on there, it was just like, wow, you know, it was so exciting. All my favourite, and purely for the reason that all my favourite bands were on that label at the time, and then they became my friends after that, and they're still my friends now. So, you know, that's kind of a cool thing.
Shin?
For me, I mean, I grew up as a teenager, the grunge days, and, you know, I mean, all those labels around that, you know, and around that sort of post-hardcore-ish sort of, you know, Touch and Go and Quicksand and those labels, and later on, like Thrill Jockey and sort of a lot of the American sort of indie labels, you know, there's a lot of them now, a lot of them kind of like merged into the whole Beggars Group and all that now, but it was like kind of the whole indie thing where, you know, beneath the major label stuff, you find this little pocket of bands that are together, and, you know, you feel the connection and you see it, and like it's like you found like a little, you know, a pot of gold with like great bands that are all connected, and like no one else knows about it, and like it was like really exciting to find that sort of little pool of bands, and, you know, it was like all on, you know, a certain label. Like, you know, when you look at the back of a CD and if it said SST, you know, there was a good band, or if, you know, it was, you know, you could trust, and it was really exciting to find out through that as a teenager, and finding records and digging records, and it just got me digging, and it was like kind of that process. And I remember before I went in, like dived into the music industry, I watched a documentary, well, interview, like a collection of interviews that Thrill Jockey put out on their 15th anniversary. I forgot the name of the DVD. It's like a 2-disc thing. It's like 4 hours of interviews, like everyone from like Ian MacKaye to, like, you know, Bjork to everyone, and it's all about how they were inspired to make music and to put out records, and it's just them talking, and it's just like, you see them, and it's like they're normal people, you know, they're like people who just love music, and it was just that connection that, you know, someone, you know, normal like me could actually go out there and try and spread music that I've actually loved and I love, and, you know, I want more people to know about it. So it's this really simple sort of method, I guess, you know, like, you know, it's like, I guess that anyone could be a musician now, it's kind of that, but like you could be like someone normal like me could be, you don't have to be a pop star, you don't have to be a mega millionaire to put out music, you know. It was that sort of comfort in seeing that. It was really inspirational to see in those sort of indie labels, I guess. So,
cool.
Yeah.
I think for me, it's like I like indie labels that sort of like create their own culture and their own community. And kind of backing up what you're saying, it's like I really like the idea that you can sort of like dive in maybe by sort of like a big flagship band, and then you start scratching beneath the surface, and suddenly you've got all of these kind of artists that may not have the attention that they deserve, and might become lost records or rediscovered one day. And I think that's always intriguing. And like Thrill Jockey's actually a label I had on my list as well, which I think is a really good reflection of that. And maybe labels like Constellations from Canada as well, who obviously put out things like Godspeed Black Emperor and Silver Mount Zion, a lot of that sort of collective and things for there. There's another side to this as well, which is for me, aesthetics are quite important for indie labels. I find that the attention to detail on packaging and things like that is actually really great on the physical product. And although I didn't have many girlfriends in my adolescence because I was too busy fondling good-looking vinyl, I guess the benefit of that is that
7-inch.
Well, whatever floats your boat, Jamie. I think the thing is that like those days are great because I just sort of like created my own sort of like kind of imagination about what could be and applied those ethics and that sort of attention to detail and transgressive with Tim. And like I think that's really important to us, is always having that kind of artistic world represented in product that is as fabulous and exciting as the music itself. The other thing I want to kind of honourably mention is the fact that there's lots of great indie labels that get gobbled up over years by majors, and that doesn't stop the music or the output being phenomenal. Like obviously Geffen licensed all the sort of Nirvana stuff from Sub Pop, and it was kind of like a split release. And we find ourselves actually in that position with Foles, where it comes out as Transgressive and Warner Brothers. But then, like a label like Parlophone for me, when I was like first buying cassettes at the age of 8 and 10 years old, like they were putting out things like Blur and Idlewild and all that sort of stuff, and Radiohead, and that for me was a really exciting time, around that Britpop era. And then also Sire as well, which obviously is now owned by Warner Brothers. Seymour Stein is actually a real mentor to Transgressive, and like when Tim and I just started the label, he flew us over to New York and taught us all about how he got into music and took us to CBGBs, and it was like an absolutely incredible pilgrimage for us. And you only have to look at the artists he signed, like the Talking Heads, the Ramones, Madonna, The Cure, the Smiths. It's pretty impressive.
Well, he's like a 70-something-year-old man, and you go to in the city in Manchester.
He falls asleep standing up.
I know,
have you seen it? Like at gigs, he's just like.
Talk about like a committed guy. He's like in his 70s. Everyone would want to be retired, but then he's still waddling down the road in the city, like
with a cane.
Yeah, like charming bands, isn't he?
Exactly, it's true. And I think he's still signing stuff, and I think that's incredible. I think I think that level of commitment is something that we aspire towards. I mean, other honourable mentions are things like, I'll probably say someone like Soul Jazz for their compilations. I think I've been introduced to so much amazing music that's global as a result of that label. So.
That's a good answer.
And for me, he's marginally older than everyone else on the panel. I mean, I grew up sort of listening to stuff on the great independent labels that came out in the late 50s and early 60s, and it's easy to forget that Sun Records, Motown, Stax, all those amazing labels were independents. I was just down at the exhibition of vinyl album covers down the road and looking at the early Jethro Tull records and going, Chrysalis was an independent record label, and all of this fantastic stuff that was coming out in those days on independent labels. And Australia just had this great history with Spin Records, Leadon Records, Festival Records. And when I really started listening obsessively to music, you could spend your entire life just listening to Mushroom Records, And when I think about labels, I just think that all of the great independent labels are the vision of what I call sort of gloriously obsessive nutcases. And all of the great labels, I mean, I think of Roger, I've just met you two, so that bears my factor. And, you mentioned, Flying Nun. I mean, that was so much Roger Shepard's vision and the bands that he pulled together and made that sort of family structure out of Flying Nun. And in Australia now there was Half a Cow, which is very much still is Nick Doughton's vision. There was Red Eye Records, which was Chris Dunn and Steve Stravakis. There was Regular Records, which was just Cameron Allen and Martin Fabini. A Go-Go was Bruce Milne, and they were just all passionate, obsessive, music fans. And you could tell that in the packaging, as you say, the attention to detail, the sleeve notes, just the way everything was put together, the extra tracks that were added. The promotion and marketing, such as it was, whenever we could afford to do it, was smart, it was witty, it was irreverent, and I kind of think when I look at Laughing Out Loud and going, why am I still doing this? I go, yeah, look, I think back to these people that were just so obsessively passionate about music and wanting to foist it on an unsuspecting public, and we continue to do that, and I think all of the labels here is just continuing this tradition that's been going for 50 years.
Cool.
And hopefully is going in another 50 years.
Cool. So I think one of the things that defines indie labels, you know, is their relationships to their artists, and I'd like to talk about that for a minute. You know, it's how do you view your relationships with the artists coming out on your label? I mean, and in the end, I suppose you have to make money. You have to make money from their music. At least you're trying to. And you know, how do you define that relationship? And you know, you want to talk? You're nodding quite a lot, Toby.
I'm just moronic. That's just what I do. I'm like a nodding dog in a car. I was just going to say, don't know. For me, it's like we sign artists. We don't sign our egos. Like I think a lot of people at major labels, unfortunately, are under really stringent, unnatural pressures to sign things that are going to churn over in next quarter's paychecks and all that sort of stuff. And the moment you get into that sort of element of the business of music, is the wrong order. It should be the music business, and it should be very much about being proactive creatively and artistically. And in terms of the artists that we look for people that, again, have got their own culture, their own identity, their own vision, and that just stretches beyond the material itself, but through to the artwork, through to their live show, through to, you know, every single sort of facet of their being, really. And, you know, we're there to be as supportive as they want us to be. I mean, you know, in some instances, we've been in the vocal booth challenging artists on their singing, right the way through to just being given a completely finished record, including the artwork, and we just put it out as is. So it really is flexible. I'd like to think that if artists want to sign to Transgressive, it's because, you know, we're there to mirror the artist and not the other way around. You know, I think that's why musically it's a completely diverse roster, is that, you know, like the best artists, we want to react against every last release we put out and make Transgressive a stamp of quality, as opposed to, you know, like an aesthetic that's only one thing. So it's always good to be surprising. And we encourage our artists to do that as well, always to challenge themselves and just be different. So, cool. Yeah.
I always feel like because of the internet, and, you know, like everyone could be like a form of media, I guess, and they could, you know, put out their own music on their own and stuff like that. Anyone could be a musician, all that. But I feel that, like, there's an importance of labels now more than ever, I feel, to be a filter for, you know, people to find out about these bands, because, you know, there's so much all over the place, everywhere, and, like, you know, even, you know, as an A&R, and I'm sure for these guys as well, it's so hard to find these good bands, because you've got to go through all these other ones that you're not really, you know, to be honest, really interested in, you know. But I think that's the same for the public, you know, because there's so much out there. You know, people have given up sort of digging, and sort of they don't really bother to find out about bands on their own. So it's very spoon-fed, especially back home in Japan. It's a very spoon-fed market. So you got to have like a certain sort of, I don't know, a platform or a filter as a label to give these people that, you know, you can trust. You can trust our label. You know, what we put out is, you know, what we love, and I'm sure you'll love. And if you don't, you know, we've got a lot of other friend labels, you know, you might love. So it's like a community of, you know, and that's the thing I love about the indies, you know, is there's that sort of side connection of, you know, there's a rivalry, but there's also a camaraderie. And I think that's very important as an indie. And as, you know, going back to that filter thing, I think it's really, you know, something that, you know, signing a band, you know, we're not really sort of selling their records and making, you know, my living. You know, I'm really sort of, because I just love the music so much, I want more people to find out about it, and I want them to use us as a platform to, you know, they've got the resources of a, you know, a proper distribution. You know, we can pitch it to promoters, so we can, you know, they've got the ability to tour, you know, because it can be very difficult to tour Japan, you know, connect them through that. And I guess, you know, I'm you know, a little different to these guys, that, you know, I live in a country that speaks a completely different language. So when I'm licensing in foreign music, you know, I've got to translate their sort of aesthetic and their world into Japan, and, you know, there's a certain, you know, element of trust that needs to be there. And so I think that's, you know, what we do. You know, I mean, I don't really care if I don't make any money out of the, you know, the records. If the band makes more money and they can make another great record, then I'm happy to help them out again, you know. So you know, as Toby was saying, you know, it can be you can get into that trap of sort of, you know, A&Ring and putting out records just to sell them and sort of make money on for yourself. But you know, I mean, I think I pride myself in not doing that. So I think that's an important thing for an indie label. So
cool. I think like having played in bands, being in a band, one of the best things about it is it's like you're in a gang. You know, it's like us fuck the world. It's us against the world. And then being in a record label is like being in a big gang. You know, and that's part of what I enjoy about it. And generally on Arch Hill, you know, one of the reasons it's sort of the best and the worst actually, because it can be, bands and gangs can be pretty dysfunctional a lot of the time, most of the time. And, you know, and the reality is in a label you're dealing with dysfunctional situations pretty much.
It's about like being a
pretty
therapist.
much all the time, but that's part of it. Yeah, sort of like therapy, gang leader, and a whole lot of
Drug
things
dealer.
like that. Yeah, drug dealer,
Dad.
and sort of chauffeur, taxi driver. I did a showcase gig the other week. So we had 7 bands and not a single one of them owned a car, I realised, except me. So there was a lot of gear loading. But anyway, I can't remember where I was going with that. But I think that sense of community is important. And for me, I don't tend to license bands from outside of New Zealand because I actually like the fact that they drop in regularly and to the office, and I see them and talk to them regularly, and I would find it a bit disconnecting, I think.
Do you ever have bands that just turn up? Like there's this new band we're working with, and they just turn up unannounced all the time, and they're like 15 years old. They just come in with their skateboards and just like, "You all right? How's it going? Oh, that CD, that's not really selling, is it?" And it's
Yeah,
like,
and they
what's that all about?
look in the fridge as soon as they get
Yeah,
there, see if there's any beer.
It's unbelievable. Fucking bands.
I think at Laughing Outlaw there's a couple of criteria. I mean, being passionate about the Sydney Swans almost guarantees you're going to get a release on the label. And I did almost turn down a band once because they wanted to thank Carlton on the sleeve of their CD. But the other thing, I think it's really, I mean, that whole gang mentality resonates with me because I think, you've got to love the music first and foremost, but equally as important is you've actually got to like the people. Because, I mean, with Laughing Outlaw, if someone came along and I was thinking I could make $1 million from them and I just didn't like them, I just wouldn't want to do it. Life's too short. There's too many great people to be working with dickheads all the time. So, you've really got to, because you spend an enormous amount of time with them, and the gang mentality certainly rules at Laughing Outlaw because you're also looking for artists that are going to like each other, and pretty much everyone on Laughing Outlaw, as far as I'm aware, supports each other. They turn up at each other's gigs, they tweet about each other's shows and records, they Facebook about them, they organise shows together, they talk each other's albums up and all that sort of stuff, and that's just like unbelievably important to sort of have that culture around the label. And you spend, you're going to get the 10 o'clock calls if, there's a domestic upheaval with someone, or someone's, needing to, you're borrowing money to pay their rent next week or something. You have this fairly intense relationship with a whole bunch of disparate people, and if you don't want to talk about their domestic life and lend them money, maybe you don't want to be working with them either.
I think, especially when you're an independent label, because you're working with artists who are either self-managed or themselves, or they don't have a big production behind them or anything like that, you're kind of dealing directly with their lives, as she was saying. So I kind of get the feeling sometimes that you go beyond that working relationship. You put an album out, but in essence, you're kind of supporting their life in a way. You're paying their rent for a couple months without advance money or whatever, and sort of that kind of gets in the feeling that you're actually a family, and you got to support them, and not just put this album out and if you go, yeah, exactly. So
you've got to be prepared to if you're going to start working with a band, it's not like I'll put out your record. It's like this is going to be at least a 3 or 5 year relationship. Yeah. Because I've never dropped a band, and I wouldn't. So if I sign them, it's I know they're going to be on my sofa.
It's marriage.
And
it's bigamy.
I know they're going to steal food off my plate. But it's really like a long relationship, entering into a long relationship with someone.
And also the point you made about not licensing people where they can't drop in. I mean, I think that's why Laughing Outlaw is so inner west, 2 kilometres from my office, centric, because it is that thing I've found over the years that if a relationship breaks down, it is usually with an artist that is from interstate or overseas, because if there's some drama, they can't call you up and you can't say, okay, look, get yourself over to the office, see you in 20 minutes, let's talk it through and sort it out. So yeah, I just find that proximity of artist to label is pretty important.
Distance can be good sometimes.
Sometimes distance is really good.
Time difference can be really helpful, yeah.
Yeah, so, we talked about musical inspiration, but I suppose one of the, another thing that defines the indies is the way they do business. And there's certainly been examples, throughout musical history of labels that, pretty much change the way people do business in the music industry. Does anyone want to speak to that?
Well, I don't think you're a record company or an indie record company until you've gone if not entirely bankrupt, then slightly bankrupt. I think, you know...
Constantly bankrupt.
Yeah, that's the thing. I think that one of the things is that that's confusing about the music industry is the fact that everything's so public and everything's so aware and present that is not at all necessarily a reflection of the finances of either the artists or the people investing in it. And that, you know, I think it's good to be honest about that, as much as that could be disenfranchising slightly and, you know, be a negative outlook. I think the reason that's a positive thing ultimately is that it forces the people to be involved in music and the artists themselves to be doing it for the right reasons, ultimately, which is to create art and create a statement and, you know, body of work that's going to exist long before our bodies are, you know, dust in the ground. So, you know, I think I've forgotten the question.
It was good anyway.
Sorry, I'm hungover. I don't know what's going on. What is this? Have I got clothes on? Oh, God.
And he's a well-organised record label.
What I was looking for was something like along the words
like a business model
of
kind of
50-50
thing.
deal or something like that. But that was good anyway.
I mean, back, you know, Touch and Go did that 50-50, I mean, it's on Wikipedia, you know, I mean, Touch and Go did the 50-50 deals with their artists, and it was like a handshake deal, like no paperwork, and they eventually went, you know, down, but, you know, I think that was a model, I mean, but it wasn't because of the 50-50 deal, it was probably just because of, you know, more people going into the mainstream or whatever, but that was something that was really inspirational for me, something like the Sub Pop Singles Club. Matador had that compilation come out each anniversary. You know, any label that had like a fan base for just the label was something that was really inspirational for me, and that's something that I'm kind of wanting to do more and more of in the future. You know, it might be old school, but it's very nice to have that community extend out to the fans, and not just with the bands, but with, you know, the fans and the people and the listeners, and to feel that. So that kind of business model of like sort of not just putting the band's music out just on a CD or a record, but having extra stuff like, you know, merchandise, just, you know, that classic Sub Pop, you know, loser t-shirts, you know, it was those types of things to keep the, you know, the label name and the branding of it afloat was, you know, something I think, you know, should happen more, you know what I mean. It's difficult, I guess, you know, when all these labels are merging together, but you know, then again, you know, like Beggars Group, you know, it's such a nice group of labels, and you know that you can trust whatever they put out is, you know, something that you should actually check out, you know, at least. So I think any label that can actually build it to that profile is something that, you know, is inspirational, and is something that, you know, definitely, you know, I'm in the young days still, but aspire to do. So
Cool. Anyone else?
I was just going to say, I mean, I'm not sure of this, the exact history, but I know Rough Trade Records early in their history sort of had that profit share model. I mean, basically they were a bunch of hippies who were also punk rockers, I think, and they had that kind of community thing, which is a really simple model where, because everybody, you know, wins if a record makes money. You know, you go, this is what it costs, we pay for that, and then we split it 50-50, and it's, you know, pretty simple. And you know, that's it's not all indie labels do it that way, but, you know, I think it can be a good model that works. Obviously didn't work for Touch and Go, but I don't.
Well, I mean, like Cooking Vinyl recently started doing the same model. We've worked with them on a few releases, but you saw them picking up a lot of the big acts, like who were on major labels, coming back and releasing stuff through that sort of model of 50-50 deals. And like Marilyn Manson and Prodigy all went back to Cooking, or not, went to Cooking Vinyl, and like they've had great success with those releases, you know, and they've probably sold more than, you know, probably what they would have done on a major label, you know, so, and probably made more money. So I think, you know, it's a very classic sort of old school way, you know, very simple, you know, 50-50, but, you know, that's something that, you know, makes us think, or makes me think anyway, about, you know, what deals that we do, you know, how much can we get the money back to the artists. And
cool. I think the Arctic Monkeys was a very hot band at the time. They came with like 10,000 fans, you know, that they were shipping around for their shows, and they had every record label wanting to sign them, like offering them huge amounts of money, and they ended up going with Domino and Lawrence Bell, who's got very charismatic, traditional indie label dude, and I think they did a 50-50 deal or somewhere about that.
I think the story was, didn't he just sort of like take him to his house and cook them dinner? And like, and everyone was taking them out to flash meals.
Yeah,
and he like, it was like,
here's
let's have a cup of
bolognese.
Yeah, let's have a cup of tea. And I think that's the thing. It's like, it's about ethics as well. Like, I think that's the important thing from independent record labels is, you know, what are your values? You know, why are you doing it? You know, why aren't you just, you know, signing stuff in the way the majors do. And I think that's ultimately what defines the culture of indie labels, is the decisions they take and the risks they take. And I think that, you know, this links into, I was actually going to mention the Arctic Monkeys Domino thing, because I think that's really inspiring. I also think likewise Arcade Fire being on Merge in the States is an amazing story, or Nick Cave and Mute, who have been together forever. You know, he could have gone elsewhere. And I think that, you know, that relationship's very symbiotic. It's beneficial for everyone.
If you're a band signed to a major label, you know, you've got a contract with an amount of, you know, with a budget, and if it's not going well, they're going to be like, we're just going to pull the plug. But if you sign to like idiots like us, we'll be like, you know, you haven't sold any records, there's no money in the bank, but, you know, here's another 10 grand, you know. So we're the kind of like business idiots that bands really should work with, because we will, you know, I know a lot of people that have remortgaged their house to put it into a band, and whenever they've done that, they've always ended up selling a load of records. So,
also, I mean, you know, independent labels, you know, we've got the luxury of working on records and artists that we love for a lot longer than any major label would. You know, we can still be re-releasing, reissuing, re-pushing 2 or 3 years afterwards, you know, because we actually believe that it's a great record that no one's paying, or not enough people are paying attention to. So we just keep going and going and going, because we're not going to flip into another cycle where, okay, we tried that, we spent our 200 grand on it, didn't work, next please. You know, we can do things a bit differently.
Yeah, cool. You know, so obviously there's a whole lot of talk about, you know, the streaming panels yesterday and stuff like that. And it would be pretty interesting to take the indie labels perspective, because I think sometimes, you know, something like Spotify does a deal with the majors, and then the indies are told that if they don't do a deal, they're almost kind of bullied into it. So, you know, and you know, I'd like to know your thoughts on a streaming service.
This end of the table will start, won't we, sir?
Yeah.
Yeah. Spotify and digital streaming services are like, you know, it's probably, in my, you know, it's probably the biggest issue confronting, I think, independent labels at the moment. And so let's lump them all under Spotify for the moment. You know, and I was kind of excited when Spotify launched in Australia, and every title on Laughing Outlaw was up on Spotify. And then I saw a massive tanking in our web sales, which just happened to coincide with the launching of Spotify here. And I started thinking about it, and I started talking to some overseas managers who I was licensing stuff from, and I noticed that their releases weren't up on Spotify. And the most telling thing was one manager, and he said, look, Stuart, as a music fan, Spotify is amazing. You know, I love it. But he said, Spotify is not a friend of my label, my artists, and my management company. And I started thinking about it, and I don't want to diss it, and we're looking at a way at Laughing Outlaw where we can put up something I didn't realise was possible, where we can put up 3, 4, 5 songs off an album, but not an entire album, because, you know, Spotify to me is like the most massive disincentive for anyone to ever pay for someone's intellectual copyright ever again. You know, why would you? You can just basically push a button, and pretty much every piece of music recorded in the last, you know, gazillion years is there. Why would you go out and buy a Laughing Outlaw release when you can just punch it up on Spotify at 4 o'clock on Sunday morning when you get home, 9 o'clock on Monday morning, you know, when you start work? So, you know, that's, you know, on the other hand, I'm all for giving music away. You know, I encourage, you know, giving away MP3s on blogs, doing all of that sort of stuff, putting up certain amounts of stuff on Bandcamp and giving it away. I'm totally all for that. But a situation where you're giving away completely.
There's one common argument. I'm just thinking about it from the public perspective, like where a lot of people I've spoken to go, the great thing about Spotify is I discover lots of new stuff and I end up buying it. What do you think about those people?
That's an excuse.
Yeah, and I'm not convinced that that people will go. I mean, yeah, I hear you on the exposure to new music, because for me it's great. As a fan, I'm hearing about some particular artist and I go, bung, I'm going to have a listen. But the take-up rate of hitting a website or going to a, you know, that thing called a record store, to actually buy, I don't think is that great. I think what it can do, and we had a big label debate recently, which now numbers about 120 emails. I put all of the artists in, what do you think about Spotify? And it was interesting that the only artists that were adamant about keeping their entire albums up on Spotify were the ones that work 70, 80, 100 nights a year, and they're getting people out to their shows. They're selling their 20 or 30 CDs and a bunch of T-shirts and whatever else they can put their name on every night. They're relaxed about it, and it helps them because it's driving people to a live situation where they'll buy stuff. But if for a lot of my artists with lots of facial hair who never go out of their living room and write songs about having lots of facial hair and staying in your living room, and we have a lot of them, I'm laughing out loud, then they're screwed because there's no place for people to go and buy their music, and it's there for anyone to listen to anytime they want to. So that's my issue with it. But I'm feeling comfortable about discovering the notion of being able to put 3 or 4 songs up so that people can go, okay, I want to hear the Charlie Horse record, for instance. I'm going to hear 3 or 4 songs, and then I have to make a decision whether to illegally download it from somewhere else, or go and buy it, but not to make the whole album available all 24 hours a day.
If you're giving away, everyone wants exclusive tracks here and there, so you're doing that to promote, and then with Spotify on top of it. I mean, I know what you're saying about, people saying they're discovering music from it, but at what point does that stop and they actually turn into, do you know what I mean? You end up, we still have to pay to record, pay for the band, pay a decent, we'd like to pay a producer because they've been working for 20 years and, they need an income as well. And at the point where you're releasing the record, if it then just can go up online and you can be sitting in your kitchen and want to hear that new record, just start listening to it and not pay anything for it, it's really, it's going to be a tough time ahead, I think.
I don't have such, I'm a bit more still undecided at the moment, but I would say though that probably for me as a label, like one of the largest income streams is probably sync licensing, and there could be an argument that music through streaming, etc., exposes more people to it, and therefore helps generate that sync licensing, and it's just a different, and actual physical sales is probably third or fourth.
What do you mean, that people hear it and they're
it helps raise the band's profile, and when it's producers, directors, and you get the sync licenses, and I mean, I guess the other probably largest income stream, which obviously is not so relevant in the US, but are performance royalties, and almost conceptually there isn't, there could say an argument that streaming is more like a performance royalty than an actual sale, but I'm undecided.
I mean, it's a large piece of the pie that's being dismissed, which was selling records, which is what we always did to fund a label. And then if you actually take that out and go, there's other things. I mean, we always had those other things, things like syncs and whatever.
I mean, you're taking out the core income stream that's kept in.
And also with sync, I think that a lot of the sync companies, it was quite buoyant a few years ago, but I think that they're all chopping down their budgets as well, because there's too many people. All of our bands are all pitching for those slots, so why would you pay 100 grand for this track when you can actually pay 3 or 4 grand, because everyone needs that money? I just think that taking, as you said, the core out means that it waters down everything else, and I don't want to be all like depressing about running a label or anything, but it is a tough time at the moment, definitely. And I think Spotify has got, I can think of quite a few positives of it, but the reality is when I get my statement at the end of the month for what I'm being paid, it's like a tenth of what it used to be.
Yeah, I won't argue with that.
Cool. Well, it's not cool at all, but so I'm kind of interested. There's a whole bunch of issues facing indie labels. One of the big ones that I don't even know, we'll know what happens, but I'd like to know, and I didn't pre-warn you guys about this, so I'm interested to know what you think. What's going to happen, and do you think Universal, if they were to buy EMI, how do you think that's going to affect your business?
Has nothing to do with me.
Not at all. Not at all.
No.
You don't think so?
Perversely, I'd rather that a music-centric company buys another music-centric company, because I think EMI was pushed to the absolute ground by its previous acquirer, and that's a controversial decision for someone that works in the indie sector to say, but it's just it's the reality of things. That company's not made money in a long, long time, and it's got an incredible archive and catalogue of amazing artists. There's lots of good people that work in those businesses. Whoever that person is that acquires it, I hope it's just looked after and is able to continue in some entity, in some form. So, I'm all about more music being created and made, and you know, I think the whole sort of like major dissing and black and white nature of it is not productive, because I think that probably everyone in this room, probably most of their music, or at least a higher proportion of it, you know, is released on a major label, you know.
If there's less major labels, it's actually better for us. Because there's bands that...
It's a 4 to 3 then.
Well,
that's what I was going to say, because I think, you know, the opportunities for people who still actually think that it's a good idea to be signed to a major label are going to diminish even further.
I agree.
And I certainly noticed with Laughing Outlaw over the last 2 years, there's artists that, you know, I've sort of dreamt of working with that are starting to make overtures, and I'm going, wow, this is actually pretty good. Let's have them all by each other so there's actually only one major record label on the planet. That'd be good.
All right, so if we look at... yeah, you go.
I was just going to say, I mean, I'm also the chairperson of the Independent Labels Association in New Zealand, and we actually submitted a proposal to the Commerce Commission opposing the merger, but largely on the basis of, you know, one large dominant major record label player. It puts them in such a strong position to dictate the terms on those digital streaming services. That's the specific point I think is concerning, is that, and all of those things. And I think I actually think it's a really bad thing, even though I think a lot of people, you know, like the initial thing is to think, oh yeah, great, that just means there's less labels and more artists available. But one dominant player, while we're in such a stage of, you know, flux, and digital stuff is so new and it's also changing, could do a huge amount of damage to independent labels potentially. That was the reason what we submitted. Unfortunately, the Commerce Commission said the merger could go ahead, so maybe I should have made it better.
Yeah, I mean, I'll go from. I mean, Air did a submission, you know, against it too, and one of our things we're really concerned about is that is just how much of every bit of the pie, every bit of that distribution chain, from recording through the time it gets an artist, how a label, a really big major label, can take a cut of your pie every time. So let's talk about, you know, how you guys distribute or aggregate your music. It's very likely to be owned by Universal, that company that does that. There's not many other options outside of that, unless you do it yourself and you have all sorts of infrastructure, and not many indies do. And the next one is that you're being bullied by Spotify. Well, you know, as we say, being bullied isn't so bad if you're taking a small percentage of the revenue anyway, which they all have equity. Now, what's going to happen when Universal also buys EMI's equity? They've then got double the ownership of all the other majors. I know that Merlin, you know, we have Charles in the room, has a very small percentage of equity in Spotify, but that worries me that they can take an even larger percentage of your cut, and then they're the ones you're actually negotiating with how much your royalty rate is. Like, I think, in terms of...
can't get any worse than Spotify.
Yeah, in terms of... I got to say that when we talk about Spotify, I talk about all streaming services, not a Spotify. Like, this is every single one of them. So there's lots of examples of that and their ability to, you know, potentially, for example, undercut the PPCA in a license that they do. You know, these things kind of worry me, and I think it's a lot more than just the acquisition of content, which is a short-term view, and it's kind of exciting because you might get some great new bands on your roster, but for the long-term future, it concerns me. But it's not about me. It's about you guys. Yeah, go ahead.
No, nothing. Go ahead. I was just telling him he was wearing clothes.
Yeah. What was that?
No, nothing.
Okay. I was watching Money for Rope yesterday under the speakers, so I haven't actually heard a word any of you have said all night. So, but they were really good. So anyway, outside of that, let's talk about piracy. I know you guys were discussing it before. I once had a conversation with Stuart where he said that he gets really worried if he can't find he actually searches for his albums on peer-to-peer things to make sure that there's enough buzz around them before they release.
Yeah, it's kind of, isn't it a weird world that we're in, where it's, you know, if I, with a lot of key releases, if I, you know, I will go out and search to see if people have put them up for a legal download. People who think they're doing me a favour. And I've said to many artists on Laughing Outlaw that it's almost a badge of honour that you wear, that enough people out there in the online world consider your album worth giving away free. Because it's actually saying that people think it's a really great record. I start to become more concerned if I can't find people giving our stuff away illegally for free, because that's kind of the world telling me that maybe this is a dog of a release that no one's going to be really that interested in outside of me anyhow. So there is that sort of thing of you know, and I guess I've also stopped trying to stop it. You know, you're in a situation where, you know, I don't think we're ever going to be able to stop illegal music downloading. I think, you know, as independent labels, we just have to accept that it's the way it is and work out ways to deal with it and hopefully turn it to our advantage. But yeah, like, you know, I find it weird that I'm concerned if people don't think one of my releases is worth giving away for free.
Anyone else want to talk about piracy?
I think like the first Foals album we put out got leaked by a journalist in the UK, and I typically, when these things happen, you know, as you're saying, it kind of is vaguely unavoidable and in a weird way is flattering. However, it can dent a campaign substantially, like, because we were aiming to get like a top 5 album, and fortunately we still did. It did really well and stuff, and it went actually top 3, which is amazing. But you kind of partly wonder, my God, is that partly because it went viral and like because people heard about it in a new way? But I don't know. I mean, we worked with the IFPI on an investigation to track this journalist down, and the reason that we actually did something proactively about that is we found out that same journalist had leaked over 1,100 albums pre-release, and I felt a responsibility on behalf of all labels and all artists to try and preserve, you know, their art coming out in the way that they intend it to and when they want it to, because often it's not just, you know, a record label trying to sort of like plan its cycles and make cash or whatever. Often it's the artist that just wants it to come out in a certain way. You know, they've worked their asses off on it, they've put their lives into producing this piece of work, and then suddenly it's just flung up, and maybe it's the wrong mixes, or maybe it's MP3s as opposed to WAVs, and all that stuff's so important, you know. So I think that, you know, the issue of piracy is just more to do with the fact that it's not really necessarily in the artist's intentions, and that to me is, you know, as a conduit of what the artist wants to put out, that's my concern really. But yeah, I mean, we were talking about it earlier. It is harder to find illegal stuff online. I think it's only going to get harder. And I think that, you know, there's going to be a generation of people sort of like kind of like maybe sort of like, I don't know, between the current 15-year-olds to maybe 25-year-olds who have been used to getting music for free whenever they like, from wherever they like. And I think and I hope that in the next 5 to 10 years, that's going to close that window. I think the next generation coming up will either get subscription services from legitimate paid-for streaming sites, or they'll buy stuff. I genuinely think that's going to happen.
Cool. Anything else? No. Anyone got any questions, by the way? I haven't seen anyone jump up.
Yeah, I'd just like to add, you know, I've got an 11-year-old daughter, and she always asks for iTunes cards. She doesn't know about streaming stuff for free.
There you go, that's good to hear. I've heard that from a few people. I just think that it is actually, like we're also saying, it's easier to kind of buy something or listen to something legitimately than it is to get something legally. And I think that's what people used to do. I think kids would hear a song on the radio, try and buy it online, but then realise you have to download iTunes and then get that and get this. And by that point, they're bored. They just want to Google it and find it and download it. But now you just get to a host of adverts and, you know, like porn sites, and, you know, that's distracting for people like me. But, you know, I think, you know, I think those days have changed.
It's been nice to be, you know, I'm happy to be transparent and say, you know, if you're going to spend £5 on my record rather than illegally download it, this is where the £5 goes. You know,
your back pocket.
It's a pretty big back pocket. But, you know, I would say, you know, spend this recording the album, this is what the artist gets, whatever. I want people to have a moral decision when they illegally download things and think, if I want to keep buying quality independent music, I want to give money to this label because it's going to keep, it doesn't go in our pockets, it goes in reinvesting to other bands, you know, and producers getting paid, and studios, and all of these kind of great people that work on making a record. They all, you know, they all should get their share of money. And if you know what I mean, I'd be happy to be.
Have you read that Steve Albini essay? Like the way it breaks down, like all the costs of what it is.
Yeah, but that was like a major label one.
It was a major label one, but like the thing that's interesting about that, it still has parallels to the piracy issue. And I think if anyone's not read that, just it's quite old, but the fundamentals of it and the expenses and the line items of how expensive it is just to put a record out, they're still fascinating, and I still refer to it every now and then. I really recommend reading it. It's really good.
But yeah, I definitely think that like people would feel better paying for a record if they knew that, you know, they knew that their money was going back in the pool and helping make other great records, you know, because when you illegally download it, it's you know, it means that we take a hit and it becomes harder for us to carry on doing our job, you know.
I think like when the internet came out and the music was available for free, like once you give someone an option of free, like you can't, it's really hard to get them back to pay for something, you know, because they know they can get it for free. But like, you know, I think we're all music fans, and like we buy something because, you know, you listen to it and it enriches your life in some way. Like you either cry with it, or you smile with it, or you have fun with it. and the music, you know, kind of enriches your life, and that's and in a way we say thank you to it by paying for it. And I think I feel, I guess, you know, it's a little different in Japan, and I'm kind of talking in that perspective, that I want kids to sort of feel, you know, that, you know, they're getting something really good out of listening to good independent music. And, you know, as a way of saying thank you, you pay that $10, and that goes to allowing the label to put on more shows for you, or, you know, put on more festivals, or, you know, put out more records for you guys. And you know, I think the whole money thing within the industry is like, it's, you know, as you said, it's really hard for the general listener to know about, you know, because they think that, you know, oh, artists make money anyway, you know, but it's not, you know, we have a hard time making money ourselves, and for the bands as well. But I think it's about educating the younger generation to actually pay for something for. And I guess it maybe goes outside of music as well, you know, like I mean, we pay to see a movie, we pay to go to a museum to see art. You know, it's the same thing for music. You know, you get something, an experience that enriches your life, and, you know, as a way of saying thank you, you should pay for it. And I think it's about educating people in that way, and kind of goes back to, you know, having the music out there for free, either piracy or whatever. I guess I have a question of, like, should indie labels branch out into doing, like, promoting shows, or not just put out records, but have something other music-related things to try and get that revenue?
Well, we
back,
actually do. That's the thing. It's like, yeah, exactly. It's like, and it's kind of like, it's twofold. It's partly because it was organic. Like, you know, I used to be a music writer, and then I became an events promoter, then I made TV shows, then I started a label, and, like, all those things are still concurrently going. And, like, the great thing is they all feed into each other. I think that it's crucial for an indie label, if it's to survive in the long term, is to have as many revenue streams as possible. And it's not about forcing an artist like a sausage factory through that process. They can opt in and opt out of those services. Like, there are some bands like Pulled Apart by Horses, or a new band, Theme Park, that we work with. You know, we promote their shows in London, and it's strategically good for them because we help market them properly, and then also it helps us get an additional revenue stream that can then be potentially reinvested in promoting them on the label. So
I think that's like the modern day model of a indie label. You know, like, you have to branch out and have different arms, and not just the classic put out the record and hope it sells kind of thing. So yeah, so
cool. Only got a couple more minutes. Just wanted to talk about your relationships with media. You know, do you reckon it's harder for indies and to get played on the radio, or to reach audiences, and you know, maybe talk more broadly about marketing and that sort of stuff, and how indies do it differently? I'll leave that one.
Yeah, we do it differently.
we do it.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, awesome. That went really well. Anyone got any questions? No, this is really bad. Okay,
There's a question.
Is there a question?
I was just, I know you guys touched on this before, but I was just thinking, so my favourite labels like Chess and Motown and Stax and kind of died in the 60s and the 70s. I'm just wondering what makes a label last a long time, and what makes a label sort of die?
I think money. I think moving with the times is really important. You know, like, it's very easy to get stuck in a rut when you've got a sound and a moment in music, but music is like fashion and art, and they all go through movements, and you have to go with the times, basically. You know, and never, but then simultaneously, which is the challenge, not go against your principles that you've laid out as a label. So, you know, for example, if Warp suddenly just started out putting out metal, it would be an extremely confusing experience for the label and the listener. But, you know, they have moved with the times. At the point where guitar music was burgeoning in the early 2000s, they found Maximo Park and put that out, and that was initially very successful for them. So I think it is about surprising and subverting the course of your A&R, which ultimately is always the first foot forward. Whatever you sign is your future. So you just have to always move accordingly.
Also, it's a very different time back then because there's a lot less distractions. You know, now you have a computer game, or there's just TV or whatever, so much going on. When you're talking about the 50s and 60s, I mean, you know, music was just coming to the forefront, if you know what I mean, like popular culture. So,
Like, music
you know,
was new. Like,
what's that? Yeah, exactly. It was new. And also, when you talk about Chess and whatever, they were doing a genre of music, you know, literally a genre. We try and keep things diverse and whatever, because it wouldn't work like that now. So I was thinking a lot about the old labels and whatever, but it's very hard to compare it. It's culturally, it was a different time. You know, the artist coming from poverty was a different time. It's just a lot of really different things, but they're still inspirational labels, you know, of course.
I guess if you have a variety of genres, you know, when tastes go backwards and forwards, you've still got
It comes in waves, definitely. I completely agree.
And I think in some ways, the actual branding of the label is kind of important, and with Laughing Outlaw, when we started, we thought, well, will we have two labels, one for the Americana stuff we do and one for the psychedelic pop music that we also love. And we kind of made a very conscious decision not to do that, to actually brand the label so that people would keep coming back no matter what stylistic changes they were, with the belief, or ill-founded or otherwise, that whatever came out with the Laughing Outlaw logo on it was at least going to be interesting in some capacity. And so, in some ways, for better or worse, the label is better known than a number of its artists. But I think that allows the label to keep a currency that we mightn't have otherwise.
What's good for us is you used to put a record out, and if someone bought it and loved it, you would just never hear back from them unless they turned up to a show. Now, because of email, it is amazing that we can go, oh, you love that, leave us your email address and we'll hit you back. I mean, that's one of the brilliant things about it nowadays. They keep coming back, which is really good. But yeah.
I think the thing that unites independent labels or good independent labels are the people who are music fans first and foremost, and then business people second. And I think the history of independent labels are littered with people that were the music fans but never quite got the business part sorted out properly. And I think, in order to have longevity, as you said, you actually have to be, pretty sharp about, you've got to do all that boring crap, business plans and accounting and all that stuff. I seem to spend more and more time on Excel spreadsheets, which is, who likes Excel? Not me. But that's how
Good label though. Good label.
The Excel spreadsheets.
Excel, yeah.
You just did a spreadsheet pun.
And the other thing that's important is, you can just get incredibly lucky or incredibly unlucky. You just never know. Every release, I'm sure it's the same for everyone. Up here, every one you put out, you don't know whether you're going to sell 15 copies or, 2 million. And, that's part of the silly lure of it, that, you go out to battle again going, well, is this one that's going to have an incredible mass appeal? And you just don't know.
Gambling.
It's gambling, or it's betting on horses, and you really just don't know. You've got the faith and the passion initially, and you're really just gambling on the fact that there's maybe 10 or 50,000 people around the world who actually share that same passion. Sometimes you're right, and, large majority of the time you're wrong.
Okay, that's all we have time for. Just want to finish by paraphrasing something that a woman, Alison Wenham, who runs the Association of Independent Music in the UK, likes to say a lot, and that is that every style of musical movement of any worth ever has started in the independent sector, and that's why these guys and the independent sector is, the most important part of the sector. It's what makes it interesting, and without indie labels, we would have a very, very boring musical lives. So thanks to these guys for talking.